All right, I think that's critical mass. So perhaps we can begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Really happy to start this session, which is very beginner friendly, and I think something that has been lacking in terms of the sessions we've been offering for the Generative AI Practice Group. And really delighted to be welcoming Dr. Irina Mirkina, who is the AI lead in the Office of Innovation at UNICEF, for a session on the do's and don'ts of generative AI. So she's going to get into a very practical session full of prompts and use cases and sort of talk through things for people who have already been experimenting with chatbots and would like to do it more effectively, but also for those who feel sort of overwhelmed with the generative AI landscape and are really not sure where to begin. We have Irina, the expert, here to walk us through some of that. So thank you all again for joining. I will pass it over to Irina. And in the meantime, colleagues, please feel free to submit your questions and comments in the chat. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. But we can also do this in a more interactive way, and Irina can interact with the chat throughout. All right, over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's all very exciting to see so much interest in this group and in this topic. And we look forward for more meetings in this practice group, obviously. And today it's a very beginner-friendly session, like Fiona said. I'm going to assume that you know something about generative AI, but there is absolutely no pressure to know anything in depth at all. Just as a very quick introduction, I will spend a few minutes on talking about what GenAI means in the UN context specifically, and for human rights, do's and don'ts that affect our work on a higher level, and then talk about how to apply several of those considerations in practice with some principles and examples of how to craft good prompts. And then we'll use GenAI. We'll use Copilot in Bing and try to see how those prompts actually result in outputs and how we evaluate those outputs. And hopefully we will have a very productive and interesting discussion. In the picture on this slide, you see some of the examples of what generative AI can do for you already. And that includes taking notes in your meeting, like this meeting, for example, and then summarizing those notes into very tidy and pretty agenda points, analyzing engagement on social media, summarizing long reports or articles or news or several sources, creating different personas and scenarios and letting you play around with talking through, for example, an interview or a social behavioral change analysis and so on. Drafting and editing, obviously, we will spend quite a bit of time on what it means to generate a draft with one of the large language models. Personalizing and restyling the content based on a specific audience that you need to craft, adopting a specific language or a particular style. Like we know that the UN style, very formal, very bureaucratic, would be very different from what you would need to appeal to a young audience, for example, or to children. So how do you do that? Machine translation, easy, we've all done that. Restyling in different formats. How do you take a press release, for example, and transform it into a blog post and then into a presentation and in any other type of content? And then a little bit of other types of generative AI that are not text-based, including image, audio, and video generation. So what it means for the UN system and for human rights. The first recommendation from me to you is to follow organizational policies, internal policies, and not all of those policies say generative AI in their title. all policies on data privacy and data protection, on cybersecurity, on sustainability, on supply management, on child safeguarding, on inclusion or prevention of sexual harassment, all of those policies still apply. And we will talk a little bit today about how those policies are affected by generative AI. What do you need to remember when using generative AI when that happens? And then the second recommendation is to not anthropomorphize AI. Neither generative AI nor AI more broadly is intelligent in the same way as humans are. And not using words like please or thank you in prompts, first of all, helps you to keep those prompts short and concise and more effective. But more importantly, it helps us to remember that we don't talk to a GPS like to a real human being, right? We don't confuse sex dolls with real women, and we don't talk to generative AI in the same way we would talk to a real human from the people, from the populations whom we, as the UN system, serve. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of what we mean by many different human rights and many different aspects of our work at the UN being affected by generative AI. Here is me trying to generate a press release about immunization, right? It's not a very good prompt for a very simple reason. It doesn't have any specific information that you would usually know about an immunization campaign. But it is absolutely not a burden for a copilot in this case, because it invented the immunization campaign, right? It invented that it happened in 15 countries and affected 10 million children. And it is even invented that it happened from May to July 2023. It made a mistake with the name of the of UNICEF's executive director. Right now, it's Madam Catherine Russell, and Henrietta Fore was our previous executive director. But more importantly, in this case, like, okay, you can correct the factual errors and you can correct other things, but look at the bias, or rather insensitive language that it has in its data. It associated immunization campaigns with violence and insecurity. And it very clearly specifies that countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is where violence and insecurity happens. And I'm not saying that this is not what happens in those countries, but violence and insecurity, as well as immunization, happen all over the world, right? So just making that assumption unprompted is an example of cultural bias that we need to be aware of when we evaluate the outputs. This is another example. First, I asked, can you describe to me a typical family breakfast? And it gave a very good answer. It says, well, it actually depends on which country you are in. In Japan, for example, a typical breakfast would be sushi. And then I said, okay, can you write a short story about a typical family breakfast? And it absolutely did. But in this case, a short story was very typical North American breakfast, and the children around the table had very typical Anglo-Saxon names. So again, the inclusion, all the guardrails that exist in those models around cultural biases or racism or cultural appropriation, they don't work that well or don't work all the time. Here is an example of how image generators see the difference between a man and a woman. So for the same prompt, with the only difference in gender, all men wear shorts, shorts and suits, and women don't wear anything much because the training data were not particularly representative of work-related women. This is an example of racial bias. So you would struggle to generate an image of Black doctors treating white children, for example. It has no problem generating an image of Black doctors treating Black children or white doctors treating white children, but struggles to imagine Black people or people of color in the position of power. And even more explicitly, if you ask for a powerful person or an intelligent person or an influential person, you usually get images or stories about people who are white and usually about men. And if you use a prompt about a poor person, an immigrant, a terrorist, I'm not going to show those examples because they get really racist really fast. Now, what does it mean for us, for our work at the UN system, for all of our agencies, no matter where you work, no matter what your profile is? Most probably your work, either internal policies or external advocacy and guidelines that we offer to the member states, they are affected by generative AI. So if you're involved with either crafting the internal policies or the external advocacy messages, please do get involved with updating those policies based on the potential risks and the impact of Gen AI on human rights, on climate and sustainability, which is horrible. We know that ChatGPT would use half a liter of water per conversation and enough energy to sustain a transatlantic flight. The threats to data protection, particularly for vulnerable populations like people on the move and children, and all the risks of fraud and disinformation and deep fakes that are amplified by generative AI. None of them are new explicitly. All of those phenomena like inequality and digital colonialism have existed for a long time, but generative AI amplifies them on a massive scale. So what does it mean for practice? How do we apply this when we actually try to use things like Copilot? First of all, take full responsibility for the output. It's not on ChatGPT or Llama or whichever model you're using. It's on you to check the accuracy, the cultural appropriateness, the well-crafted response that you're producing. It applies to images, it applies to text, it applies to video, whatever you are doing. Check the outcome and look at it critically, evaluate cultural biases as well as accuracy. And if you can, if you have the time and the opportunity, try to follow the 4 eyes rule or many eyes. I'm not going to make assumptions about how many eyes you might need, but cross-check with colleagues and experts. We need to normalize the practice where I might reach out to someone to say, hey, can you check this for me? And you would check, you would ask the same from me. We never trust the outcome being produced just by one person. The second recommendation is to remember that the output will be different every time. It's a probabilistic generation. It's never a kind of copy paste in the page or copy paste in a fact like Google search does, for example, right? It literally recreates, kind of like autocorrect, trying to predict the next word in a sentence, which means that even with the same prompt, if we use it individually, all of us will get very different answers, as we will see in just a few minutes today. And the next one is, do not expect ChatGPT or any large language model that you're using to show any kind of inclusivity or accuracy or cultural awareness, right? It's very tempting to use it for translation into many languages, to to generate text about countries where you've never been, and so on. But no matter which guardrails those companies say they have implemented, and they are trying to implement guardrails, the models themselves, trained on unrepresentative data and embedding the current biases and existing inequalities, societal inequalities, they will perpetuate those biases and inequalities. So again, it's up to you to watch out for when that happens and redraft it yourself. Now, for prompts, there are several specific schemes that you might need to follow. So if you remember this scheme, it will be very easy to draft more prompts, regardless of context or regardless of what you're trying to do. Usually you would have a specific output or specific action in mind. So you need to produce a report. So you would say, generate a draft of a report, or you need to restyle a press release into a video script for YouTube, and you would literally say that, right? So there is an action, there is a target output that you have, and you have a specific style or format in mind. And that style and format depend on the length, how long that report or that YouTube video should be. The language, what do you want to use a language that is very like UN style, sort of bureaucratic, very formal, very official, or do you want to use the easy read style for children, so it could be easily understood by not just a very generalist audience, but by someone who is very young? Explain like I'm 5, that kind of style. You also can adjust the tone. It can be more empathic. It can be more joking if necessary. And you usually want to specify context. What do you want to produce this for? You want to give very clear instructions. And to do that, you usually want to think through all of these things beforehand, so you can draft very clear, very specific prompt by including all that information. You might want to use positive language, so say do this instead of don't say jokes, don't tell jokes, right? Try to avoid that negative language, mostly because large language models are not very good at handling negation still. And experiment with strict conditions, like you must follow this rule, or you must follow this style, or you will be penalized for doing something, like responding in bullet points, for example. And you can also provide examples and context that will improve your outputs significantly, because you literally give an example of what you want to imitate, right? A style that you want to imitate, or a particular format that you want to copy. You want to work step by step, so don't start with, okay, give me a full report, right? Generate a draft of a report. No, you want to say, here is the topic of the report that I need to produce. Can you generate an outline for that report? Okay, now from that outline, let's take chapter 1 and generate an outline for chapter 1. From that outline, give me a description of one paragraph. And then from that, step by step, you will get better results, because for different reasons that I'm not going to go into, but it has to do both with memorization and information retrieval, but also with the fact that it's much easier to keep that outline in mind and generate, kind of fill in different parts by keeping it as a context for Copilot to fill in, than to try and cover everything. And then if it doesn't work for you, then you have to recreate a whole thing, right? Try to recreate small things. You might want to use delimiters, such as quotes, tags, and other delimiters to separate what is an instruction, what is an example and what is the expected format, for example, or the context for your question. Again, it doesn't have to be that way, but if you have a long prompt, it usually helps the model to separate what it needs to take into account. And if you get stuck, or rather, if the model gets stuck and says, I think this is a good enough answer, or I cannot answer, or keeps repeating the same thing, you can just start a new conversation. And even with the same prompt, I assure you that you will get different results. Now, let's try this on. I invite you all to go to copilot.microsoft.com, and we'll use a creative version of it. And I'm going to switch for a second to make sure that I can see the chat and everyone. Cool. Once you have opened the Copilot, once you have opened the chat, here are several prompts that I invite you to try out for like step by step. First, it's about trying to restyle an existing article, which is an official press release from the UN. It's a real press release, so it's a very official UN style. What happens if we try to generate a blog post from that article? So, Fiona, should I copy paste it, or will you do this?
I'm happy to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So there will be text in the chat for you to copy paste. Please feel free to do that, or just type it in Copilot. And this should be fairly quick. So for all 4 prompts, let's say I'll give you 4 minutes, 5 minutes maybe. And please raise your hand or speak up if you have a question or struggle with something. I hope that everyone is doing well. If you're not, please give me a shout out. What I would like you to notice is how quickly or how slow is Copilot at responding to your prompts. What do you notice in restyling or translation? Particularly in translation, if there are any mistakes in there, if you can evaluate that. And as it changes the style or adopts a different language, do you think that that language is appropriate? Do you think that it's a good representation of how a UN personnel would do that? Okay. I hope that you all have had the time to go through all four prompts by now. So let's switch to the next one. This one is an illustration. So the first one was about restyling and reformatting the content. This one is about going from a more high-level outline to a specific answer, right? And it's an imaginary example, but let's say that you might use the same principle in other tasks that you need to do. So in this case, we would write the terms of reference for a new vacancy, and then suggest if that vacancy requires a written assignment, requires that the candidate submit a written assignment, which tasks might be suggested as part of that written assignment. And then in the end, you would ask what is a good answer to one of those tasks. And again, I don't expect you to evaluate the quality of the answers. That's not the point. The point is to see the sequence from the high level to the specific paragraph. How would that go? And I'll give you a couple of minutes for this one.
Irina, can you paste the prompts in the chat again, please?
Fiona, could you please do that? Because
Yes, I'll do that.
I don't see the chat. That's half of the problem. Sorry about that. Okay, I hope that everyone has had the time to complete these prompts. If not, no worries at all. There will be a recording, obviously, and I will be able to share the presentation afterwards, so you will be able to try it out in your own time and your own pace. The next use case, let's try to see what happens if you adjust the tone, the length, and the audience of a draft that you're trying to craft. So in this case, let's take an email. You generate a draft for an email addressed to team members, and then you adjust the tone to make it shorter and snappier, to make it more empathic. And then what would change if you would send it to the senior management instead of your team members? How would the tone or how would the output change as you adjust the different parameters in the prompt? And again, I think this would be super quick, so a couple of minutes or less. Okay, and the last use case and the last play case, I would call it. This is about taking notes and transforming notes into agenda or action points as a result, and also about summarization of different content. In this case, I would suggest the prompt that searches for a transcript of a TV series or one episode from The Office, but take it seriously. Take it as the transcript of an actual meeting and use that to generate the summary of the actual meeting, what happened. Summarize the meeting notes, highlight the topics, separate suggestions, and tell us what are the next action points that are going to happen after this meeting. This should be super short and I hope funny. And then we'll open this for discussion, because I think the most valuable part of this is to actually hear feedback and hear your thoughts and questions so we can discuss them. So let's say 1 minute, and then we'll open up the discussion. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to open this up for your questions or reflections. Please raise your hand and tell us, how did it go? First of all, what I would like to hear is, did you enjoy seeing the responses? Did you notice if those responses were accurate or inaccurate or biased? And did you notice the differences in responses when you adjust the style or the format or the language? And if you have any questions more broadly on GenAI, please. And I see one hand already. Please, go ahead. Ahmed?
Yes, hi. It's Asan actually, and I had a
sorry.
delay in unmuting myself. No, thank you so much for this presentation, and I must admit that I am honestly just a little bit shocked at how good this co-pilot is working. And my immediate reaction is like, in the context of the UN and hiring and promotions and getting rostered, how does one, assess, like, with these written tests that we are always given, this just blows everything out of the water. You can just ask it to do it for you and then tailor it or change a thing here or there. So as a, this is already here now.
Yeah.
How is the organization going to respond to this in terms of our assessments for hiring and promotion? And I'm just wondering what happens next. So anyway, that's just my initial reaction. Thank you so much, and looking forward to learning more. Over.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, and like I said in the very beginning, it's going to affect organizational policies. So HR policy obviously will be affected as well. More practically, more specifically, what I'm advising all colleagues and all country offices at UNICEF currently is to include oral evaluation or as part of the interviews, probably of like just talking through the written assignments if there are any, right? So the main point is, if we want written assignments as part of the evaluation, it's not about whether or not the person can do that themselves or do they need ChatGPT to do that for them. The main point is, do they understand what the outcomes are? And if they do, then they're a great colleague, just like you and I. We also can use Copilot and produce great outcomes if we understand when to correct for bias or for accuracy. So a human that can produce good output, but using Copilot, is simply more effective in their work. But checking that they actually do understand what they have submitted as the written assignment, that should be part of the interview process at this point. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't see the hand. No, I do. Fernando, please.
Hi, thank you, Irina. It's really, really interesting what you are saying, and great, and in a very good timing. My question is regarding the job opening. Well, related to a previous question, a colleague of mine was joking that next application will be done by AI, so we will use AI to submit our application and our exams, and the organization will use AI to evaluate it. So it will be funny. But my question is regarding to the job opening that that we created. Is not very much UN-like. So is there a way of asking a Copilot to use as reference the UN? But to do that, do we need to have embedded Copilot in our work, or we can use the free version?
Great question. Fantastic question, because it touches on the data privacy and security question. For most UN agencies, I don't know if for all, but my assumption is that for most UN agencies, Microsoft has an official agreement, so Copilot is an official software that you can use with your work account. Please do check it with your organization. But once you've logged in, your data will be protected within that environment, and you may submit internal documents and know that they will not go beyond the environment of your organization. In that case, you can just copy paste the text of an existing TOR and say, okay, I need a copy of this, but this is for a full stack developer and I need someone for a software engineer, and Copilot will be able to rephrase it or reframe it. Do not submit internal UN documents on any external websites. That's obviously the question of the data security. And there are versions that allow Copilot or other LLMs to look up the text from an external link. So like in this case, for example, I said, here is a press release published as an article, right? Published on a news website. And it was able to look up that press release and extract all the information. Theoretically, you can submit a link like this to an existing vacancy because it will be public on the internet, but there are still limitations for content that Copilot can or cannot access. So copy pasting it in a safe environment is still more preferable at this point.
Thank
And Johanna, I saw your hand, the thumbs up, so I'm assuming that Copilot and Microsoft is available for everybody. Yeah, fantastic. Rose, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, Irina. Thanks so much for this amazing presentation. It's just so accessible and wonderful and also a bit fun while being very helpful. I'm wondering if you could help some of us understand with the emerging AI regulations and governance about areas that may be important to have more caution around when applying this. I know that, for example, the AI Act in the European Union have some high-risk areas, and there's also the governance that's emerging at the UN, and would love your perspective on that.
Wow, that's a huge question. The short answer,
smaller one.
yes,
About
it's
that.
a fascinating question, but yes, thank you so much for this. So the short answer is the regulations like the UAI Act and also the executive order in the US and other regulations that are upcoming in other countries, they try to regulate the applications of AI to make sure that things like data privacy or data use are well thought, trying to remove the bias from those models and prevent negative outcomes from like racial profiling and so on, and also regulate human oversight or mandate human oversight in many cases. So when I say, please remember that the responsibility is on you, this is what literally every national regulation says. There has to be a human who will take responsibility for the decisions or for the outputs that AI produces, because a machine cannot take that responsibility. And also, yeah, accountability and redress and so on. The UN is actively involved, so the Secretariat, the Office of Tech Envoy and other organizations, ITU and UNESCO, are very heavily involved in harmonizing international standards for AI, as well as building a system of international governance, because AI, like all digital technologies, does not stick to national borders. A model can be created in one country, trained on data in other country, and applied or used in a third country. How do you regulate that? You cannot do that with just one country regulations. So what the UN is working on, what are the overall principles based on human rights that all countries need to follow, and how would that look in practice? that's a big question. I think we will see some results of that from the high-level advisory body on AI in late August or early September. But yeah, it's a lot. Thank you for this question, Rose. Sylvia, please.
Thanks, Irina. Thanks so much for the great presentation. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the impact on expectations around work productivity. Like, of course, there is an expectation that AI will help us be more efficient, but like you showed many examples that it's not at all straightforward. And there is sort of an aspect that's organizational expectation versus like the responsibility that ultimately seems to kind of fall on individuals to critically look at outputs and review everything. So yeah, just interested in your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Wow, fascinating question. I think it will be very individual in many cases. Like a lot of entry-level jobs, according to the report from our colleagues at ILO, will be affected by generative AI more significantly than more expert jobs. Mostly because, yes, simple tasks like summarizing reports or drafting very simple templates can be automated, right? Where there is very little originality, where it's mostly about copy pasting existing content in a new format, like that kind of work can be automated to some extent. However, for expert colleagues, especially those who will, like you said, will have to take responsibility for checking the accuracy and crafting a good prompt in the first place, like thinking about all the information that you need to put in the prompt as context to get a good response, that takes time. Right. And then you see that the responses are kind of average, kind of mediocre, and then you need to redraft the prompt and submit it again. And in the end, oh gosh, I better go and draft that thing myself. Just stop it. So a lot of colleagues that I've talked to who have been using Copilot for a while found ways for like very specific tasks for which they know that an average and mediocre response is good, and they use Copilot for that. And there are tasks where they're like, okay, I'm not going to do that because it will take me more time to actually talk to the machine, to that probabilistic lottery machine, than to draft it myself. So at this point, I would not expect any huge increases in productivity or any job substitution. It's not going to replace you and me anytime soon, but just find the applications that work for you. See what happens.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Sonia, please.
Yes, my comment is about updating the hiring managers in terms of prohibiting the use of AI when attending written assessments. For me, as a hiring manager, I'm not interested to hire somebody who's not using AI. He's not a better employee. So I would focus more on soft skills, on their ability to leverage the artificial intelligence. And why is HR not catching up with the technology? Why are they not allowing people to use AI? This is mind-blowing. This is just a comment. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic comment. Thank you so much. And yes, very true. Andres, please.
Hi, thank you. This is Andres from DPO. Sorry from the background noise, but maybe one comment and one question. I think the comment is that also I see this technology as an equalizer. So for me, English is my second language. So when I'm writing text, I use this technology just to make it like more coherent, to have like more coherent text. So I see this technology as an equalizer in some ways. So that's the comment. And then the question is like, when we were doing the activity, I noticed that we just like submitted the prompt completely. Like, what is your experience in like filling up the prompt and then like doing the task in different steps? Does the system fall into any rabbit holes? Do you see any? What are your recommendations on like enhancing the response and then continuing like interacting with the response that the system already gave? Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the yes, it absolutely is an equalizer, particularly for non-native speakers. So to some extent, it does help white-collar workers, at least. Obviously, it is not producing equality all over the world, right? It really kind of deepens the digital divide between people who have access to the internet, to Copilot and so on, and people who don't have that access. So for us at the UN system, for all of our agencies, looking at what happens to the digital divide is very important. Like, our productivity is great, but does it serve the people whom we are trying to help? In terms of rabbit holes, like I said, try to restart from the beginning if you see that it's going into a direction that you don't like. I find that it usually helps. If you craft a strong prompt and kind of submit it several times, you might get 3 different answers and then kind of pick and choose different parts of those answers. But I'm also going to say or advertise a session that Fiona is organizing next week, I think, with Microsoft, which will be fantastic because it will be all about prompt engineering, and they will talk a lot more about how to actually, craft better responses and maybe not get stuck in rabbit holes. Okay, a couple of more people. Asan, please, again.
Yeah, I'm back. I mean, that was my initial just, knee-jerk reaction to what we had just done. And now that, we've gone through the questions, I was just thinking about how this might apply to my current daily work. And I had a scenario just the other day where, like, my boss, she needed me to produce a concise, a concise summary of developments pertaining to like land use, and somebody did this, somebody did that, and got inputs from different people. And it took me so long just to make sense of what I was fed via email and attachments. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the limits of the application and our accessibility rights, usage, whatever, like today, sitting, like if I had this session the day before yesterday, is this integrated with Outlook? And can I tell it, hey, can you go through, this email thread and go through the PDFs that are attached and give me a one pager on what this guy is talking about? Because I could not make heads or tails out of it. It was such a struggle to say this happened, but then that happened, but then that happened because of this. And it was just a very, it was almost like a dyslexic, inputs that I was being given, and I was just struggling to make sense of it. Over.
A fascinating question. So whether or not it's integrated with your Microsoft Office products depends on the agreement that your specific agency has with Microsoft. So some agencies do, some agencies don't. The reason why I've used the web version today for demonstration was to avoid that discrepancy. But even if a Copilot,
well, assuming that it is integrated with, because I think I had my FTS guys turn it on for me, and so it pops up in different applications. But assuming that it is,
assuming that it is, I would still not recommend it, right? Because again, it does not produce information. It does not produce knowledge. It produces language patterns, kind of like autocorrect on your phone, just in pages instead of word by word. What it produces, or what it's looking for, the frequencies in how different words are used, or how different words are related to one another, or how close they are in documents. It does not produce the actual answer that would make sense to a human expert. If you, as a human expert, were not able to make sense of that conversation, I would assume that the summary that Copilot might produce would be either very high level and superficial. It would look okay. it would look very coherent, but it would not necessarily make sense because it will be just like these words kind of reflect these words were kind of used in the emails that you have submitted. But whether or not they actually correspond to the meaning that those emails or those reports were trying to convey, that's a whole different question. That's a huge struggle currently in the legal field, because a lot of lawyers would love to use generative AI to summarize hundreds and thousands of precedents, laws and regulations and bylaws and regulations. And they cannot, because no matter how good RAG or other algorithms for information retrieval are, it is not a factual thing. It does not produce knowledge. It's up to you whether just knowledge patterns or language patterns or words that seem like they belong in that context, if that would be helpful for you to answer to your boss. I don't know. Alla, please.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Yeah, I have a question related to what you just mentioned about legal aspects. So should the use of AI be acknowledged? And is it a big deal if it's acknowledged or not in any work?
I'm going to say it depends. Like if you're using it constantly to generate every single email, probably you can just assume that yes, all emails by now are at least like we are already using AI for like spell checking, right? So at what point do we start declaring that? However, there are parts like if the draft was generated by AI, you need to declare that, and you need to declare that there was or there was not human oversight. You need to declare who were the experts who actually checked the output. If it's an image generated by AI, you absolutely must declare that it's not a real image, it does not represent real people or real situation, and so on. There are situations where organizations have gotten into really bad reputationally risky situations for not declaring that image did not represent real situations. And yes, if a chatbot is interacting directly with the users or like the customers, or whoever it is, the externally facing user, without a human supervision on your side, then it's legally mandated to declare, like in most countries by now, to declare that this is an AI, this is not a human. We are not going to pretend that it knows what it's talking about. Yeah. The last question, I think we are super out of time, but let's do this.
So hi everyone, my name is Shashank Rai. I'm from UNICEF, International Computing Center. Lovely presentation. I just want to sort of summarize a few questions that I see coming up, and as ICC, we do see that happening in different agencies. So in terms of using this with your agency accounts, it is really up to the agencies to enable it. I think for UN Secretariat, somebody just posted a message. I think all UN IT organizations of your agency are looking at it. So really, I think I'm not a lawyer, but if you have to be cautioned, then do understand that unless enabled by your IT organizations for your account, the data you provide to any of those tools will not be covered by UN PNI. So I really don't want to scare off people from using it, but just be cognizant of that matter. I mean, I did have a lot of comments and thoughts around some of the other pieces, having played with some of this, but in interest of time, maybe sometime later. But thank you, Irina, for such a lovely presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Shashank. This has been absolutely lovely. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, for joining me in this playground. This was wonderful, and as we expected, the discussion was the most valuable part. We'll see you in the next meetings already next year. Please do come. We have more sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, everyone.